47 years means nothing anymore. The words hung in the crisp morning air of Oak Ridge Country Club as Martin Everett clutched his termination papers. His weathered hands, the same hands that had sculpted this championship golf course from nothing, trembled slightly. Around him, sprinklers hissed across perfectly manicured greens that he knew better than the lines on his own palm. A small crowd of well-dressed club members pretended not to stare while clutching mimosa glasses, their whispers barely disguised behind manicured nails and expensive watches. In the shadow of the clubhouse veranda, a man in a simple blue cap, pulled low over his eyes, paused his breakfast, watching the scene unfold with an intensity that went unnoticed. Richard Dempsey, the club's new director, stood with perfect posture, his $5,000 suit catching the golden morning light. His smile never reached his eyes as he explained how the club was modernizing its landscape management. Behind him, a younger man in pressed khakis demonstrated a tablet displaying lawn care analytics software. "The board has unanimously decided to embrace cutting-edge agronomy," Dempsey announced loudly enough for nearby members to hear. Martin's gaze fell to the soil beneath his worn work boots, soil he had amended, tested, and nurtured by hand for nearly 5 decades. The morning breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and expensive cologne, mixed with something more acrid, the unmistakable stench of injustice. Several members shifted uncomfortably, but no one stepped forward. "Your final paycheck includes 2 weeks' severance," Dempsey continued, checking his Rolex. "We'll need your maintenance keys before you leave." Martin's arthritic fingers reached for the key ring that had hung from his belt for decades. Each key had a story: the shed where he'd sheltered during storms, the irrigation room where he'd worked through countless nights, saving the greens during drought seasons. As he reluctantly extended his hand, a chair scraped against stone, heads turned toward the veranda. The man in the blue cap stood, removing his sunglasses. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Tom Hanks, Hollywood icon and unexpected guest at this members-only breakfast, walked deliberately toward the unfolding drama, his expression unreadable, but his purpose clear. The Oak Ridge Country Club existed in a bubble of privilege where time moved differently. Behind its ornate gates, the recession had never happened. Climate change was an inconvenient conversation topic, and status was measured in inheritance rather than innovation. Martin Everett had been invisible here for most of his life, a human fixture like the classical statues that dotted the landscape. He had arrived as a young Vietnam veteran when the course was little more than ambitious drawings and bare soil. His hands had planted every oak that now majestically framed each fairway. His back had bent under decades of nurturing the putting greens to their legendary smoothness. Club members boasted about the course to business associates, accepting compliments as if they'd created it themselves, while Martin remained in the background, a ghost in overalls who appeared before dawn and disappeared after dusk. Richard Dempsey, by contrast, had arrived 6 months ago from a corporate background with an MBA and a mission to optimize club operations. He spoke in PowerPoint phrases and saw the grounds as data points rather than living things. When the board had unanimously approved his landscape modernization initiative, not one member had asked about the human cost. Now, as Martin stood clutching his termination papers in calloused hands, the weight of nearly 5 decades of invisible labor hung in the air between them, heavier than the morning mist that still clung to the distant rough. "Martin, you have to understand," Dempsey continued, his voice carrying the practiced empathy of someone who had terminated dozens before. "The membership expects state-of-the-art maintenance now: soil sensors, drone monitoring, computer-controlled irrigation." He gestured toward his young assistant who stood nearby, tablet in hand, looking simultaneously proud and uncomfortable. Several club members had stopped pretending not to watch, and now openly observed the scene, cocktails forgotten in their hands. An elderly woman whispered something to her companion, who shook his head slightly. "I've kept this course green through 3 major droughts," Martin said quietly, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "I've rebuilt these greens after floods that would have bankrupted the insurance. And we appreciate that dedication," Dempsey interrupted, glancing at his watch. "But the board feels it's time for a more scientific approach." The club members, watching, shifted uneasily. A few looked down at their shoes, studying the grass beneath them with sudden interest. Others nodded in agreement with Dempsey, murmuring about necessary progress and competitive advantages. None made eye contact with the groundskeeper, who had learned their preferences, remembered their children's names, and silently fixed the divots from their frustrated swings for decades. The social contract was clear. Martin's invisibility had always been part of the arrangement. Only now, in the moment of his dismissal, had he become uncomfortably visible. Tom Hanks had arrived at Oak Ridge the previous evening for a private charity event discussion. The club's management had proudly offered him their finest guest suite, overlooking the signature 18th hole, the same hole where Martin had worked until midnight 30 years ago, when a young member's wedding needed the course to be perfect the next morning. Hanks had risen early, preferring quiet observation to the orchestrated attention that usually surrounded him. He'd requested a simple breakfast on the veranda, dressed in jeans and a cap that helped him blend in with the early morning landscape. His presence was a secret known only to the management, who had planned to make a formal announcement at lunch. Now, as he rose from his table, conversations hushed, and phones emerged from pockets, their cameras ready to capture whatever might happen next. Hanks moved with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to being watched. His steps were measured, deliberate, each one closing the distance between Hollywood royalty and the gardener whose world was collapsing around him. Members who had been avoiding Martin's gaze suddenly straightened, adjusting their posture, fixing their expressions. The thin veneer of exclusivity that coated the club cracked slightly as Hanks, a man who could enter any door in the world, chose to walk toward the least powerful person present. Dempsey's practiced smile faltered as he recognized the actor. The tablet-wielding assistant frantically whispered something about getting a photo later. Martin, still staring at his termination papers, remained unaware that one of the most beloved figures in American culture was now standing directly behind him, studying the scene with eyes that had portrayed both fictional heroism and genuine compassion throughout a legendary career. "Excuse me," Tom Hanks said, his voice instantly recognizable. The simple phrase cut through the morning air like a perfectly driven golf ball. Direct, purposeful, impossible to ignore. Martin turned slowly, his weathered face registering confusion at being addressed by a stranger. Dempsey, however, immediately shifted into celebrity greeting mode, his corporate smile rebooting as he extended his hand. "Mr. Hanks, we were planning to formally welcome you at lunch. What a pleasure to have you with us today." He stepped forward, attempting to position himself between the actor and the groundskeeper, a physical manifestation of the social barrier he believed should exist. "I'm Richard Dempsey, Executive Director. I hope you're enjoying your stay with us." Hanks acknowledged him with a brief nod, but kept his focus on Martin, whose eyes had widened with recognition. "I couldn't help overhearing," Hanks continued, his tone conversational but firm. 47 years with the club?" He extended his hand to Martin, who hesitantly accepted it. "That's quite a legacy, sir." The simple gesture, a handshake between America's most beloved actor and a gardener, sent ripples through the watching crowd. Phone cameras clicked frantically. A woman in tennis whites whispered urgently to her companion. The young assistant with the tablet stood frozen, uncertain whether to document this unexpected moment or pretend it wasn't happening. "Just doing my job, sir," Martin replied, his voice steadier now. "This course has been my life's work." Dempsey attempted to reclaim control of the situation. Yes, Martin has been with us a long time, but as I was explaining, we're implementing cutting-edge technology to take Oak Ridge to the next level. He gestured toward the assistant, who fumbled to display something impressive on his tablet. Our members deserve the very best. The best, Hanks repeated thoughtfully, looking around at the immaculate grounds. I walked the course at sunrise. It's extraordinary. He turned back to Martin. You've created something special here. Created? Dempsey's laugh was short, dismissive. Martin's just the groundskeeper, Mr. Hanks. The temperature around them seemed to drop several degrees. Several club members winced. A distinguished-looking man in golf attire took a strategic step backward, distancing himself from Dempsey's comment. Hanks's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes, the same eyes that had conveyed complex emotions to millions on screen, sharpened. Just the groundskeeper, Hanks repeated, the words hanging in the air. He turned to Martin. Would you mind showing me that oak near the 14th green, the one with the unusual branch pattern? I noticed it during my walk. Martin's eyes lit up with recognition. The lightning oak? Of course, sir. Dempsey interjected. Mr. Hanks, I'd be happy to give you a proper tour of the facilities. Perhaps Martin can finish his exit procedures with HR while... I'd prefer Martin's expertise, Hanks replied, his tone pleasant, but leaving no room for argument. After 47 years, I imagine he knows stories about this place that aren't in any brochure. He gestured for Martin to lead the way, deliberately turning his back on Dempsey and the watching crowd. As the unlikely pair began walking across the manicured lawn, Dempsey called after them, Martin's keycard access has been terminated, Mr. Hanks. Without breaking stride, Hanks removed his guest access card from his pocket and handed it to Martin. I think we'll manage. The club members watched in stunned silence as America's most beloved actor strolled away in deep conversation with the man they'd spent decades overlooking. Phones recorded the moment, but most captured only backs. Hanks in his simple baseball cap and Martin in his worn work clothes, two men walking as equals across a landscape that suddenly seemed to belong more to the gardener than to those who paid to play on it. Did he call it the Lightning Oak? A silver-haired member asked quietly. Hit during the '87 storm, another replied. Martin saved it, worked on it for months, when everyone said to cut it down. Never knew that, the first man muttered. Dempsey stood rigid, clutching his tablet like a shield, as whispers spread through the growing crowd. The assistant shifted uncomfortably beside him. Should we follow them? He asked. Absolutely not, snapped a woman in expensive golf attire who had appeared beside them. Eleanor Whitfield, she introduced herself with steel in her voice, club board member. Her gaze swept over Dempsey with undisguised disdain. You've made quite an impression on our guest, haven't you? The whispers around them grew louder. Members who had moments ago been avoiding Martin's gaze were now openly discussing him, sharing stories they'd never acknowledged before. The time he rescued a member's dog from the water hazard, how he remembered everyone's anniversary with a fresh flower on their table, the Christmas he quietly arranged a proper burial for a beloved grounds cat that children had adored. Stories emerged like golf balls found in deep rough, hidden but suddenly uncomfortably visible. The lightning oak stood majestically near the 14th green, its asymmetrical branches stretching against the morning sky like arthritic fingers, damaged but dignified, much like the man who had saved it. Martin and Hank stood beneath it, their conversation inaudible to the small procession of curious members who had followed at a respectful distance. Phone cameras documented the scene from afar, capturing what would soon become viral images. America's favorite actor listening intently to an elderly gardener, their faces animated in genuine conversation. I grafted 3 separate branches, Martin explained, pointing upward. Most experts said it couldn't be done with a tree this size, but I couldn't let it die. Generations of weddings have happened under this tree. Hank studied the massive trunk, running his hand over a lightning scar that had been carefully treated and preserved. "It's beautiful," he said simply. "Damaged, but stronger for it." Martin nodded, emotion briefly overwhelming him. "Like most worthwhile things, sir." Across the course, chaos had erupted in the clubhouse. Eleanor Whitfield had convened an emergency meeting of available board members in the oak-paneled library. Dempsey stood before them, his confident facade crumbling as he explained his modernization initiative. Through the windows they could see the distant figures of Hanks and Martin moving from the lightning oak toward the signature 18th hole, followed by a growing procession of members. "Let me understand this correctly," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the murmurs around the table. "You terminated a man who has dedicated nearly half a century to this club without consulting the full board." "The executive committee approved the landscape modernization budget," Dempsey replied defensively. "Staff changes were implied." "Staff changes," another board member interrupted, "not firing the man who is practically the living history of Oak Ridge." "My grandson asked him about the course for a school project last year," added another. "Martin spent 4 hours showing him every species of tree, explaining how he selected them for disease resistance decades ago. Did you know he planted different varieties as an ecological safeguard? That's why we didn't lose our entire landscape during the blight that devastated Riverview Club." Dempsey hadn't known. His modernization plan had assessed the grounds purely in terms of maintenance costs and aesthetic uniformity. The living knowledge contained in Martin's experience had never appeared on any spreadsheet. Outside, the crowd following Hanks and Martin had grown larger. Members were calling friends, who arrived in luxury vehicles to witness the unfolding situation. Staff members emerged from various buildings, abandoning posts to catch a glimpse of the Hollywood star who had chosen the company of their colleague over the club's elite. As they reached the 18th hole, Martin's pride and joy with its island green that rivaled the famous 17th at TPC Sawgrass, Hanks stopped walking. The crowd behind them grew silent, sensing a moment was coming. Phones rose in anticipation. Martin looked confused as Hanks turned to face the assembled group, which now numbered over 60 people. The actor's expression was thoughtful, measuring his words as carefully as he did his film roles. "I've been fortunate in my career," Tom Hanks began, his voice carrying naturally across the manicured landscape. "I've played characters who built extraordinary things, men who created airports, saved soldiers, piloted miraculous landings." He gestured to the immaculate grounds surrounding them. "But I've rarely seen anything built with the care and dedication I've witnessed in the last hour." The crowd had grown silent, phones recording but forgotten in hands that hung motionless. Even the birds seemed to pause their morning songs. "Martin has spent the last 45 minutes showing me not just a golf course, but a living ecosystem. Each tree placed to protect the next, each contour of land shaped not just for play, but for sustainability." Hanks turned to Martin, whose weathered face showed a mixture of pride and embarrassment at being the center of attention. "He hasn't once mentioned his termination. Instead, he's talked about what's best for the course in the coming drought season, which saplings need extra attention, which greens might need special care." From the back of the crowd, Richard Dempsey emerged with several board members. His expression oscillated between professional damage control and genuine alarm as he realized the full scope of what was occurring. Eleanor Whitfield stood beside him, her critical gaze fixed on the club's director rather than the unexpected celebrity. "I've played a lot of characters in my time," Hanks continued, addressing the growing audience. "Some were fictional, some were real people with extraordinary stories. But they all shared something important. They understood that true value isn't created by technology or systems or even money." He looked directly at Dempsey now. "It's created by people who care deeply about their work, who see beyond spreadsheets to the living reality of what they build. A murmur moved through the crowd. Several phones lowered as their owners became too engaged to remember they were recording. Martin stood straighter, his eyes glistening with emotion he struggled to contain. "When I arrived yesterday," Hank said, "I was told Oak Ridge is one of the finest courses in the country. This morning, I discovered why." He placed a hand on Martin's shoulder. "It's because for nearly 5 decades this man has poured his knowledge, his care, and his heart into every inch of this land. That's not something you can replace with an app or a soil sensor." Dempsey stepped forward, his crisis management training kicking in. "Mr. Hanks, while we certainly value Martin's contributions, the club must evolve with—" "Evolution," Hanks interrupted, his tone remaining conversational but carrying an unmistakable weight, "is about adaptation and improvement. But the most successful evolution builds on what came before. It doesn't discard it." He gestured toward Martin. "This man is not just your employee. He's the living memory of this place." The crowd had swelled beyond the initial curious onlookers. Kitchen staff in white coats stood at the edges. Maintenance workers paused their morning duties. Even the young professionals operating the pro shop had emerged to witness the unfolding scene. Martin's colleagues, the people who worked alongside him in roles equally invisible to the membership, watched with expressions that moved from surprise to something approaching vindication. "Let me tell you something about storytelling," Hanks continued, shifting into the role of narrator that had made him beloved worldwide. "In Hollywood, we spend millions trying to create authentic moments, genuine connections that audiences believe. But here's what decades in film has taught me. You can't fake authenticity." He gestured toward the tablet in the young assistant's hands. "Technology is remarkable. I've worked with some of the finest special effects teams in the world. But no algorithm has ever created something as perfect as this." He swept his arm across the landscape that Martin had cultivated for nearly half a century. "This wasn't built by software. It was built by human hands that understand soil and seeds, weather patterns, and wildlife. It was built by someone who sees this land as more than just a product." Eleanor Whitfield stepped forward from beside Dempsey. Unlike the director, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable, she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to power. "Mr. Hanks, as a board member, I must say we're deeply honored by your presence." She paused, glancing at Martin with newfound consideration. "And perhaps somewhat enlightened by your perspective." A ripple of murmurs moved through the gathering. Several members nodded, their expressions suggesting they were reconsidering long-held assumptions. The young assistant with the tablet looked down at his screen, then back at Martin, as if seeing the contrast between digital analytics and living knowledge for the first time. "In my films," Hank said, addressing everyone now, "I've often played characters who must choose between efficiency and humanity, between systems and people. It's rarely the systems that audiences remember." His voice carried a gentle but unmistakable moral authority. "When I walk through airports, no one ever tells me they love the way Forrest Gump optimized processes or how Captain Miller maximized resource allocation. They remember the humanity. They remember the heart." Martin stood silently beside him, dignity evident in his posture, despite the emotions clearly visible on his weathered face. For perhaps the first time in his decades at Oak Ridge, he was not invisible. Phones continued recording, capturing not just Tom Hanks, but the man beside him, the groundskeeper whose life's work surrounded them all. Dempsey attempted once more to regain control. "We certainly appreciate your thoughts, Mr. Hanks. Perhaps we could continue this discussion privately and—" "I don't think so," interrupted a distinguished older member who had emerged from the crowd. "James Harrington," he introduced himself, addressing both Hanks and the gathering, "founding member of Oak Ridge." He turned to Martin with unexpected humility, and apparently a man who has taken for granted the extraordinary work happening right under my feet for 47 years. James Harrington's presence changed the dynamic instantly. As a founding member whose family name adorned the main clubhouse wing, his authority transcended even the board's collective power. He moved with the deliberate confidence of old money, stopping directly in front of Martin. "Mr. Everett," he said formally, "I owe you an apology, not just for today, but for 47 years of oversight." He extended his hand. "My father helped establish this club. He would be deeply disappointed in how we've honored, or rather failed to honor, your contributions." Martin hesitantly shook the offered hand, his expression a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. Around them, the crowd had grown completely silent, witnessing a seismic shift in the club's rigid social hierarchy. "Richard," Harrington turned to Dempsey, whose complexion had paled considerably, "I believe the board should reconsider this termination immediately." His tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Several board members nodded in agreement, their eyes now fixed on Martin with newfound respect. Hanks watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction, stepping back slightly to allow the moment to unfold without his celebrity overshadowing it. His intervention had catalyzed something, but what happened next would reveal the true character of Oak Ridge Country Club. Eleanor Whitfield moved forward decisively. "As acting chair of the board, I propose an immediate vote to overturn the termination." She looked around at her fellow members, all in favor. Hands rose throughout the crowd, not just board members, but regular members as well, along with staff who had no official vote, but joined in symbolic solidarity. Dempsey stood isolated, his modernization initiative collapsing around him as quickly as his career prospects. "Furthermore," Whitfield continued, warming to her role in this redemptive moment, "I propose we create a new position, Director of Grounds Legacy and Training, with Mr. Everett heading a program to document his knowledge and techniques for future generations." More hands rose, accompanied now by scattered applause. Martin's colleagues exchanged glances of disbelief and hope. The young assistant with the tablet stepped forward unexpectedly. "I'd like to volunteer to help document Mr. Everett's methods," he offered, looking at Martin directly. "If he's willing to teach me. The technology should complement your knowledge, sir, not replace it." Martin nodded, his emotional composure finally breaking. A single tear tracked down his weathered cheek as he turned to face the lightning oak in the distance, the tree everyone had told him couldn't be saved. Tom Hanks placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes," Hanks said quietly, for Martin alone, though microphones caught his words, "the most important thing we build isn't visible to the naked eye. It's the respect we earn, the legacy we create, the lives we touch without even knowing it." The morning sun had risen fully now, illuminating the immaculate landscape that had been Martin's life's work. As if on cue, the sprinklers shut off across the course, their programmed cycle complete. In the sudden silence, the only sound was the gentle rustling of thousands of leaves from hundreds of trees that Martin Everett had planted with his own hands. A living applause that would continue long after cameras stopped recording, and this moment passed into club legend. By afternoon, the story had transcended Oak Ridge's exclusive boundaries. Video clips spread across social media platforms with the unstoppable momentum of a perfectly struck drive. Tom Hanks' Saves Gardner trended nationally, followed quickly by 47 Years of Loyalty and Invisible Heroes. News vans gathered outside the club's ornate gates, where security maintained a respectful but firm perimeter. Inside, an emergency board meeting had been convened in the mahogany-paneled conference room, where decisions about membership fees and tournament schedules were typically the most pressing concerns. Martin sat at the center of the table, a position he'd never occupied before, with Tom Hanks beside him as an unexpected advocate. The termination papers had been officially rescinded, replaced with a new contract outlining his role as Director of Grounds Legacy and Training. The salary figure made Martin blink twice when he first saw it. "This represents the value we should have recognized long ago," Eleanor Whitfield explained, her tone suggesting this was a business correction rather than charity. "Your expertise has maintained property values and membership prestige for decades. We're simply adjusting your compensation to reflect that reality." Richard Dempsey sat at the far end of the table, his tablet untouched before him. His modernization initiative hadn't been entirely abandoned, but had been fundamentally restructured. Technology would support tradition, not replace it. The young assistant, whose name everyone finally learned was Jason, would work directly under Martin, documenting the groundskeeper's lifetime of knowledge while introducing compatible technological tools. "We'd like to offer you a retirement timeline of your choosing," James Harrington added. "Whether that's next year or another decade, the position is yours for as long as you wish to hold it." Martin's weathered hands rested on the polished table surface, hands that seemed out of place amid such luxury, but that carried the authority of decades of honest labor. "I'd like to work until I can't anymore," he said simply. "This course is my home." Outside the clubhouse, the story continued to evolve beyond anyone's control. Major news networks picked up the viral videos, broadcasting them alongside commentary about workplace loyalty, ageism, and the tension between technological progress and human expertise. Talk show hosts incorporated the incident into monologues. Social media exploded with similar stories from groundskeepers, maintenance workers, and service staff across the country, people whose decades of dedication had gone unrecognized and undervalued. "You've started something bigger than Oak Ridge," Tom Hanks told Martin as they shared a quiet moment on the veranda later that evening. The actor had extended his stay, declining the publicity opportunities that his team had frantically suggested. This wasn't about his image, he'd insisted. It was about something more fundamental. "I never wanted attention," Martin said, looking out over the 18th green as sunset painted it golden. "Just wanted to do right by this land." "That's exactly why this story resonates," Hanks replied. "Authenticity can't be manufactured or bought. In an age of artificial everything, people recognize the real thing when they see it." Inside, the club's social media accounts were experiencing unprecedented engagement. The marketing team, initially panicked by the potential PR disaster, had pivoted to embrace the narrative. A hastily produced video featuring Martin sharing the history of the Lightning Oak had garnered more views in 6 hours than all previous club content combined. Membership inquiries had spiked, with prospective members specifically mentioning the club's values and heritage in their applications. The maintenance staff, accustomed to entering through back entrances and working in pre-dawn hours to remain invisible to members, found themselves receiving unprecedented acknowledgement. Members greeted them by name, asked questions about their work, expressed appreciation that had been absent for generations. Several longtime employees reported that it was the first time in decades they had been looked in the eye while on grounds. "Mr. Dempsey still has his job," Martin observed, nodding toward the director who was visible through the clubhouse windows, engaged in serious conversation with board members. "I wouldn't have wanted him fired on my account." "That's because you understand something fundamental about leadership," Hank said. "Real authority doesn't come from firing people. It comes from building people up." He studied Martin's profile in the fading light. "You've been building things your entire life, not just this course, but a legacy of care that will outlast both of us." 1 week later, Tom Hanks had returned to Hollywood, but the transformation at Oak Ridge continued to unfold like a carefully tended landscape. Martin arrived each morning to find a changed atmosphere. Staff members walked with straighter backs. Members greeted maintenance workers by name. The invisible social boundaries that had defined the club for generations hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had softened, becoming permeable in ways that would have been unimaginable before. The Lightning Oak had become something of a pilgrimage site. Members brought guests to see it, recounting the story of Martin's decades-long care with newfound appreciation. Children asked to hear how he had saved a tree that experts said couldn't be saved. The club historian, a position that had existed mostly on paper, was now actively documenting Martin's oral history of the grounds, recording stories that would otherwise have been lost forever. Richard Dempsey had undergone perhaps the most remarkable transformation. His initial humiliation had given way to genuine reflection. The technological innovations he'd championed were being implemented, but with Martin's guidance ensuring they enhanced rather than replaced human expertise. The two men could be seen walking the course together most mornings, Dempsey with his tablet, Martin with his decades of experience, finding unexpected common ground in their shared commitment to the land. "The technology actually works better this way," Dempsey admitted during a board meeting. "The soil sensors provide data, but Martin knows why the readings matter and how to respond to them. It's a partnership that's greater than either approach alone." The story's reach extended far beyond Oak Ridge. 3 major golf publications had requested interviews with Martin. A prominent documentary filmmaker had approached the club about featuring Martin's story in a series about unsung American craftsmen. Other exclusive clubs across the country were quietly reviewing their treatment of long-term staff members, recognizing the potential reputational risk and the moral imperative that Oak Ridge's viral moment had revealed. Martin himself remained largely unchanged, arriving before dawn, caring for the land with the same dedication he always had. But there was a subtle difference in his demeanor, a quiet pride that came from finally being seen. On his workbench in the maintenance shed, beside the specialized tools he'd collected over decades, sat a framed photograph of him standing with Tom Hanks beneath the Lightning Oak. It wasn't celebrity worship that had prompted him to display it, but rather what it represented. A moment when the invisible had become visible, when a life's work had been acknowledged, when doing good work had proven to be enough. Some things, Martin often told the young staff members who now sought his mentorship, take a lifetime to build and only a moment to appreciate. He would gesture toward the Lightning Oak in the distance, its asymmetrical beauty, a testament to patience, care, and the quiet dignity of work well done. "But that moment," he would add with a smile, "makes the lifetime worthwhile."